Let's check in with our friend Chauncey DeVega, a political essayist and commentator, contributor to Salon, host of the Chauncey DeVega Show podcast. ChaunceyDeVega.com is the website. You can tweet him at Chauncey DeVega. I just retweeted your tweet, Chauncey, saying you'd be on the program. So glad to have you back with us. Thanks for joining us.
It is. It's always a pleasure. Thank
you. You wrote an absolutely brilliant piece for Salon. I read the reprint of it. I don't recall if it was Alternet or Raw Story or wherever it was, titled "A Scientist Explains the Psychological Insecurity That Drove White Voters to Trump." Can you summarize that for us, please?
Yeah, it's a wonderful and very, very important article by Diana Muntz, who's a political scientist, a very senior political scientist. And what she does is she takes on this tired zombie idea that it was white, working-class economic anxiety that drove Trump and buoyed Trump to the White House. And what she does is she actually looks at a series of interviews over about 4 years with voters. And what she discovers is, as you know, as your listeners likely know, it was not about economic insecurity. It was about status anxiety, nativism, and racism. Those are the key elements that drove Trump into the White House and that motivated his voters. It was not the quote-unquote white working-class economic anxiety because, again, as other data tells us, the average Trump voter in the primaries, they made about $72,000, which is significantly higher than the national average.
Right, and in fact, you pointed out in your article that rally in Michigan that Trump did, wasn't it like the average income in that town was $100,000?
Yep. $100,000 at that hateful rally where he was screaming about Hispanics, where he was talking about, quote-unquote, illegal immigration. And you look around that predominantly white audience with a few black and brown folks, many of them who were paid to be there, and they're ranting and they're railing. And the reality of it is these are not economically distressed, lost Americans. This is not the forgotten America. And we talked about this I think last year, actually. One of the biggest problems with this argument about, quote-unquote, white working-class economic anxiety and Trump, or working-class anxiety, is where are the black and brown folks who are being hit by globalization? Where are the black and brown folks who are part of the working class? Why didn't they support him? Well, the answer is obvious, because his candidacy was based on white supremacy.
Right. So if he was selling, if his sales pitch was, I'm going to lift up working people, then working people, regardless of race, would have supported him. And that's not how it shook out. What it shook out was basically white people supported him, and wealthy white people at that. Not rich white people, but, you know, way above the median for the middle class. We're talking with Chauncey DeVega. Chauncey, you mentioned class anxiety as the first of the three reasons that white people were voting for Trump. I'm guessing that a lot of people don't know what that means.
Well, basically, it's a way of talking about status anxiety.
Or status anxiety, excuse me.
Yeah, if you're a member of the dominant group, culturally, politically, economically in America, that's white folks. White folks control every major social, political, economic institution in this country. Now, that doesn't mean there aren't poor white brothers and sisters and struggling white brothers and sisters, right? But as a group, you look at society, and white Americans are terrified. We have a lot of data about this, right, about feeling obsolescent, feeling, especially white Christians, that the quote-unquote culture has bypassed them. You know, during the campaign, when Trump was asked when he wants to make America great again, what year does he want to go back to, I think he said 1953. Well, that's a lie about the past, this empty nostalgia, an era when gays and lesbians were forced in the closet, black and brown folks couldn't vote, women were subjected to the whims of their husbands, women were treated as second-class citizens. So status anxiety is really a way of saying, we're the top dog, we're going to stay in control, and we're going to support Trump no matter what. And that's very, very challenging for Democrats, liberals, and progressives to understand. And it poses a real challenge in terms of electoral politics, because Trump's voters, they're in love with him. I've said this before. It's libidinal. They see him as a hero. And you can't make rational appeals to them because they're deeply tied to him in terms of an existential anxiety about power.
Yeah. There's a transition that's happening that I think that with regard to status anxiety, that white people broadly are aware of, and that is being amplified certainly by Fox and right-wing hate radio. You know, I know specifically of a nonprofit organization right now that's seeking to expand its board, and they're specifically looking for minorities. So basically, white men need not apply. I had a conversation a year or so ago with a television network that said, you know, we're not interested in any more old white guys. You know, we're looking for people of color. Those kinds of conversations are, maybe rattling is the wrong word. I don't know if it's too strong or not strong enough. But those are the kind of things that are necessary. They're important. We've got to undo the damage that has been done, you know, of 400 years of racism in the United States. And yet, I guess there's no and yet, but And I'm not sure where to go with this other than, you know, how do we handle this? How do we handle this in a way that doesn't blow up in our faces, Chauncey?
Well, one of the things we learned in this research, and again, Dr. Munz's article, and there's so many others. I mean, I encourage all the quote-unquote talking heads on TV to actually go out and read some journal articles, actually go talk to social scientists who've been studying these issues, not looking for hot takes. One of the inoculants against Trumpism is improving our educational system. Looking at the data, what do we know? Folks who are more educated, well, they're more tolerant. They're more embracing of cosmopolitanism. They're less prone to anxiety about racial diversity. So I think we need to fix our school system. And here's another real serious challenge in this moment. And this is also a function of a backlash against Barack Obama, because a lot of this is symbolic politics. So if you grow up you're a white man of a certain age, you were told I can go get a job with a high school degree, and I'd be able to have a house, I'd have 2.2 kids, I'd have a car, I'd have all these weeks off of vacation.
Yep.
And then lo and behold, you know something is wrong with the economy. We're all feeling it. You know something is wrong with, I would suggest, a deep sociopathy, a sickness in our culture, the culture of cruelty. And then you turn on Fox News and you're told, you know what? And this goes back, President Johnson talked about this. W.E.B. Du Bois talked about the psychological wages of whiteness. So instead of being told, hey, it's the plutocrats, it's the 1% that are robbing everybody blind, you're told, guess what? It's those black people. It's those brown people. It's those immigrants.
They want your job.
You have a whole lot. Yeah, you have a whole lot of folks who looked at Obama and they were jealous. They're hateful. He's a symbol of success, intelligence, and refinement. And then Trump comes along, who represents everything wrong with America. But guess what he tells you? I'm going to make America white again. And he plays on their insecurities. So, no, there's no easy solution, but we have to talk about a true we the people democracy. We got to fix these schools, and we got to bring people together.
Yeah, I agree. Over the weekend, I was listening to a program on the radio, or a podcast, I guess it was, and it was a neurologist, a brain scientist, and he was talking about how it takes 10 milliseconds, 10 1,000ths of a second for our brain to detect that someone is consequentially different from us. And race is one of the way up on the list. That race and gender way up on the list of things that we recognize before we recognize that we've recognized them. And they used the example of this soldier who just died last week, who had been the guy who caught Lieutenant Calley murdering people in Vietnam, and how he had felt that he was that Calley and the other soldiers, American soldiers, were his people. And when he saw this massacre going on, he flipped, and he identified with the Vietnamese as his people, and was willing to threaten to shoot Calley and his buddies if they didn't stop killing these people, and they stopped. And that led to the whole thing being unraveled. And it was a fascinating conversation about how we define who's with us and who's outside of us, outside of our group. And given how rapidly these decisions, or not decisions, these analyses are made at a level that's way below consciousness and certainly below conscious control, it raises a really interesting question, Chauncey, and I'd love to get your thoughts on this, about how do we change the perception of white people in America that black and brown people are not an us to them, into we're all Americans here, we're all us. How do we do that?
Well, I think we're in this country right now, there's a striking lack of moral leadership, period. And if you had real moral leadership, you would have folks coming out saying, you know what, as I said, we're in this together, so we the people democracy. Look to your black and brown and white brothers and sisters who are going through the same things. Don't give in to the petty fascism and authoritarianism of Donald Trump and the Republican Party, because you hit on something there. And in terms of thinking about the psychology, what you're also talking about is social capital, right? A type of bonding capital that's tribal, where it's my tribe, my tribe, my tribe, right? And Fox News and the right-wing hate media, and this will be provocative and scary to some, they have been, for the last few decades, perfecting a language, going back to Newt Gingrich and before, that's called eliminationism. What? Democrats and liberals? Well, they're the enemy. They're vermin, they're snakes, they're libtards. So when you hear Trump talk about snakes, when you hear him use violent rhetoric to talk about non-white people, and you see his voters responding to this, well, that's signaling to that same sort of primitive part of our brain. We have a lot of research about brain science that shows that the conservative brain is more fearful, it's more binary. In many ways, it's more threat-oriented. Conservatives tend to fixate on negativity, and they also have deep, deep, deep anxieties about death. So I wish I could tell you what a simple solution would be, but I would say we need better moral leadership. We need, as I said, to fix the schools. And here's another data point where we talk about what we know, not conjecture. Looking at the last election, Trump did really well not in communities that were racially diverse, but in white communities that were not really, quote unquote, suffering or being, quote unquote, invaded by, quote unquote, illegal aliens.
Right.
Folks who learn to live next door to each other and see people as human beings, well, they get along fine for the most part.
Yeah.
But if you can have a racially authoritarian president and a racially authoritarian right-wing media and political party telling people to be afraid, that doesn't end well. And there's some serious echoes in this country of what we saw in Germany in the 30s. This is not going to end well. And I've been trying to sound the alarm.
Yeah, I agree, and I've been as well, and we just have a minute before we're going to hit a hard break here, Chauncey. So it seems that the idea that, I mean, we tried this with busing back in the 60s and 70s, of bringing people together by way of social engineering. It doesn't seem to be working. In fact, we're more segregated in some ways than we were then. Correct me if I'm wrong. Any specific suggestions? I mean, you know, media, it seems like our media loves to amplify our differences rather than our similarities, for example.
Well, in the busing is a great example in the sense that, you know, folks talk about, quote unquote, social engineering. Well, all societies are involved in social engineering, all right?
Sure.
And they should come together and establish rules. A lot of those policies weren't followed through on. Period. They were stopped. We didn't, you know, we hit the 1960s and we had a series of laws that were passed that, you know, one of my favorite sociologists, Joseph Fagan, he very famously said, you know what, I don't need any new laws. I want you to enforce the laws on the books, the Civil Rights Act, the Fair Housing Act, the Voting Rights Act, which are all under siege by Donald Trump and the Republicans, by the way. So I say enforce the Constitution and enforce the laws. Can you make people treat each other well? No, but you know what? We can pass effective laws. We can create opportunities in the commons for people to come together, and we can enforce laws that break down segregation in housing and lending and in the banking industries and fix our schools.
Right, and tragically, we've got, as a result of, you know, 13 of the last 17 Supreme Court justices being appointed by Republicans, we've got a Supreme Court that delights in tearing apart the Voting Rights Act. Chauncey DeVega, chaunceydevega.com. Chauncey, thanks so much for being with us today.
Thank you for having me.
Always great to get your thoughts and insights. I appreciate it. In Los Angeles, hey, Tony, what's up?
Hi, Tom. I just called because as being a woman of color, being a black woman or whatever, we've done everything to try to make things better. Mm-hmm. Albert Einstein called it the disease of white people.
Yeah.
Most people don't know he was,
racism.
You know, really... Yeah, adamant about race relations or whatever. And it's funny, you never hear about that, huh? That
Yeah.
he's a genius, but, a genius shouldn't be talking about racism.
Yep.
And the bottom line is white people, it's in the DNA of Americans to be racist. We don't need another damn study. You just had some guys try to lynch some brothers the other day, the police killing black men like the 40 going west. So, I mean, we don't need any more studies. We know what has to happen is the liberal, so-called liberal white people that have been silent have to stand up and do something. It's nothing else I can do. I'm a victim of it. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So what black people are getting to the point is, damn fighting you and trying to beg and trying to ask. No, what more and more people of color are going to do is separate. Let you all do what you want to do, and we will build our own community separately. And that's basically what it's going to come down to, because anytime, just like you just said, they were willing to impeach Bill Clinton over a blowjob. However, this fool 45 can get away with everything, and then it's like people are like, but we just don't understand. It's supporting white supremacy, period.
Yep.
What is so hard? It's not hard.
And white privilege on an ongoing basis. Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, constantly. And what white people have to do is figure out that your silence is you're being complicit.
Amen. Back to what Chauncey DeVega and the conversation that we had at the beginning of the second hour of our program here about an hour ago, a little more than an hour ago. And this brilliant piece that he wrote for Salon back on May 7th, he says, despite the news media's obsession with the so-called white working class and its purported economic anxiety, in quotes around white working class and economic anxiety, he says that did not seem to be the prime motivating factor for Trump's supporters at this rally. The median household income in Washington Township, now this is where Trump was giving his rally last week in Washington Township, Michigan, is almost $80,000 a year. Average household income there is more than $100,000 a year. Like most Trump voters, those attending his rally were motivated by non-economic factors, by other factors. The evidence that racism, sexism, and nativism motivated Trump's voters is overwhelming. And he says voters who were more concerned about the economy, white, working-class voters who were more concerned about the economy, overwhelmingly voted for Hillary Clinton. While white voters who demonstrated more bias and hostility to non-whites overwhelmingly supported Trump. First and foremost, Chauncey DeVega writes, it was white identity politics centered on a deep fear of losing social status and political power in a changing America that propelled Trump into the White House. And I brought up the issue of an organization that I'm part of that's looking to add people of color to its board, and of media organizations that are looking to bring people of color on board, which I think is a good thing. I'm supportive of that. I'm enthusiastic about that. In fact, I think that these institutions, long-term, long-scale institutions, like our media and like, our nonprofit organizations, our corporate structures, things like that, that have been basically repositories of white power and white identity, need to be integrated, for lack of a better word. There needs to, we need to be bringing a variety of people, and not just people of color, but also women and also people who represent the variety of gender identities that exist in our society, bringing all these people together. That said, you're going to hear from white people that, oh my God, there goes my job, right? Look at all those people of color who are now in my business, or look at all those, now we've got, women or gay people. This is back in the 70s. I'm old enough to remember in the 70s when the whole Pat Buchanan thing was about women coming into the workplace. I don't mean literally Pat Buchanan, but basically that worldview that Pat Buchanan has historically represented, probably literally Pat Buchanan. And it was women at that time. Women are going to come into the workforce, they're going to displace men, and this is going to be the end of patriarchy, and, your ability to raise your family and all is going to be blown up, et cetera, et cetera. And, Gloria Steinem is evil, and she's a communist, and Jane Fonda, she's going off and protesting the war in Vietnam, and we need to take her down, and et cetera, et cetera. And for a lot of working-class white people, particularly white men, this is a real issue. This is a thing. Right? Women taking my job, people of color taking my job, now it's gay people taking my job. And they don't recognize, they don't acknowledge, they don't even understand that for hundreds of years in North America, and for thousands of years all around the world, it had been a very narrow and very male slice of whatever country. And it wasn't always white, it depends on the country, pick your country, right? But basically, the predominant, the dominant racial / religious group, the men in that dominant religious and racial group have basically dominated country after country after country over time. And that's certainly been the case here in the United States with white men. And so the white men who are not in control, but who are watching control be lost are freaking out. And the Republican Party and Fox so-called news and right-wing hate radio, which is almost exclusively white, have all been exploiting this. So what's the solution? I tossed this out to Chauncey, and we really, he kind of passed on getting into a deeper conversation about it, but I want to drill into it a little bit. It seems to me that the answer is to open opportunity more broadly. And this was Chauncey's response, was, we need to expand education, make it free, make it available to everybody. That is one of the most important ways to do that, to accomplish that. And the other one that I would point to is breaking up, is supporting small and medium-sized business, breaking up these giant conglomerates in every single industry that are mostly, not only are they concentrated power and concentrated wealth, but they're also concentrated whiteness. And if we were to diversify in industry after industry after industry, if we were to diversify the size of businesses. Along with that, you would see diversification among, having to do with race, having to do with class, having to do with gender and gender identity. You would see these kinds of changes happening. So once again, it's like this whole white power thing and the backlash of white people to the diversification of America is again coming out of cancers in our society, in this case an economic cancer that was planted there by Reaganism and during the Reagan administration. It's amazing. It all began with Reagan.